Morning, everyone. This is Tammy Zadunik with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. I'll be your moderator for today's program. Thank you for joining us. This is a private presentation not open to the media. Secondary recording of any portion of this presentation is strictly prohibited. Today, we're pleased to present Classifying, Vetting, and Managing Independent Contractors, What You Need to Know. The webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly for on-demand viewing. Participant cameras and audio will be turned off during the presentation, but if you need assistance anytime or want to ask a question of Amy, please do so in the chat box, or you can use the Q&A box. A copy of the presentation slides will be shared in the chat box. I'll also be sending you instructions after the webinar is complete and how to print your certificate, get the handouts and everything like that. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Amy Keeley.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I know. And thank you, listeners, for joining today to learn more about classifying, vetting, managing independent contractors. I hope that I'm able to provide some information that maybe you didn't know, or some reaffirmation of what you did know. And as I go through this presentation, I do talk about what's on the slide, but there's also things that I just discuss informally. So again, this is being recorded and you have access to it. So obviously the picture you can see that's there is that at any point in any time when you're in a group setting in a formal office space, or even working virtually, you may be working with independent contractors and you may not even know it. You have employees and you have independent contractors. So we want to understand a little bit more about independent contractors, because there are serious ramifications and fines from the IRS if you've misclassified and you're using a worker. So my background, as I will share more, is I've been a college professor. I've worked in the corporate world. I've spent the last 20 years working for staffing companies. I've taught HR classes in the corporate world. And so my specialty areas are business supply chain marketing, generational, and workforce management. And that's partly why I decided to approach the chamber about talking about 1099 contractors, was based on the last presentation that I gave, which is based on the Zoomer generation, which is age 7 to about 22, which are just now entering the marketplace. And it really dovetails in with what 1099 contracting will be in the future, and why it's important to make sure that you understand how to use it. So we'll go through some critical notes as we begin in this focus area. We'll go over some of the things that I gave in the Millennial and the Gen Z presentation just recently, so you can always reach that online as well to watch that video. And you'll see a little bit more about these generations and why it becomes really critical to understand about 1099 contractors. We'll talk about the IRS jurisdiction over the term independent contractor and employee as a worker classification. And then we'll talk about classifying workers based on the form 1099, which is what you get if you're an independent contractor, and the W-2, which is what you get if you're an employee. And then we'll talk about vetting an independent contractor versus an employee, which is critical, as well as court as common law rulings, and then managing an independent contractor, because you have to manage them differently. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you're taking notes. I think that Tammy said that there are questions available in the chat box that you can put in, and I'll answer questions at the very end as well. So the IRS is promoting its open door policy. So it's become more critical for customers and businesses to really understand what an independent contractor is, because now they're done suffering as being treated as employees, and those days are over. I know of many situations where companies have independent contractors that have reached out to the IRS to notify them that they're being treated as an employee versus an independent contractor. So it's more important now than ever that they be acknowledged as independent contractors and treated as such. But when you're hiring them, you need to understand, I guess, is that this isn't just a wave of the future. It's not a trend. It's not going away. In the staffing world, we call it the gig worker, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. But this isn't a trend, and I'll explain why. And therefore, you must be able to hire and understand the difference between a W-2 and a 1099 contractor, or you risk very large IRS fines for misclassifying, as I mentioned. So I'm going to go through a few of the slides that I gave with the Millennial and the Zoomer, but basically the juxt of it is that high schools and colleges have catered to student demand and not businesses anymore. So if you look at colleges, for example, they have entrepreneurship programs, they have entrepreneurship classes because their customer, which is the student, is asking them for that. And what does that mean? I mean, think about it. That means that they're saying, I don't want to work in corporate. I want to be able to run my own business. And what they will do is either run a true business with employees, or they'll be an independent contractor, which is that they are a one person acting as a company and getting tax, giving companies the tax relief from the burden of having to pay their taxes. They're responsible for them. So again, we're already starting to see that for several years now, the schools have been training workers to not work in corporate America. And that's why you started to see the millennials start to not want to join corporate America and wanting to be freelancers. And you have sites like Upwork that have been able to do that. So just to give a quick overview of the generations so that you can see, Gen Z is, this is from the Pew Research, which I use a lot of for secondary research data. So you can see all the different generations. We are now in a very unique situation of having 4 generations in a workforce that hasn't happened in decades. And that requires a lot of navigation because you don't want to alienate your older generation that has most of your knowledge. But you don't want to alienate the younger generation because the millennial and the Gen Z are the largest generations that are out there. So according to a Snapchat survey, it showed that 40% of US students who have defined their path are basically looking at non-traditional career paths. And what does that mean? Non-traditional means that they don't plan on working in corporate. They plan on working for themselves. And they figured out, by the way, how to be able to monetize social media, sell on eBay, and a lot of different things besides going into corporate. So again, there's more evidence and support showing that, there's research showing that they don't plan on working. They are very individual. Especially the Gen Z, their values have changed. They are looking for a quality of life balance. And that's why you see the Starbucks, I read it, just an article yesterday, the Starbucks CEO is begging workers to come back to work. And the answer is they've lost control of the workforce. And so companies really need to start to understand and embrace that you have lost control of your worker. So how do you begin to engage with workers that don't want to work for you as an employee? And the answer is 1099. So again, they're very entrepreneurial and they're very competitive. So using them as a 1099 versus trying to entice them as an employee is this shift that businesses need to make, especially now that they're having hiring problems, is to think differently. And think different means don't look for employees, look for 1099 contractors. So I gave some examples of this is, a 6-year-old who's running a $20 million business for, doing cookies at Mercedes and Ralph Lauren. This young lady is amazing and has already partnered. She started at 3 years old, building her own social media business. You got these young men that have sold nearly $1 million worth of socks on an idea, and they started at age 13. So again, you have a younger generation, and this young lady, 5 years old, is now selling at like her lemonade, and has become competitive with some of the bigger companies that are out there, and she's only 5. So you've got this generation that has decided that they want to be their own business owner. And so again, how do you shift and do that? And the answer is to look at 1099s. So when we look at this, I wanted to take a step back and look at the fact that the IRS has the jurisdiction over the term employee. So every law that's out there has the words that are in that law defined. And for tax purposes and for other reasons, the IRS has the term employee. So I've provided the definition so that when you get a copy of this, you'll have that definition. But it means any individual who, under use of common law rules, applicable in determining the employer-employee relationship. So again, if you look over here on the left-hand side, it says you are not an independent contractor if you perform services that can be controlled by the worker or by the employer, and what will be done and how it will be done. And this applies to you even if you are given freedom of action. And that becomes critical later on when I'm talking about the fact that, for example, if you're an executive and you're able to plan your own day and decide what you want to do, that is a similar freedom that an independent contractor will have as well, but it's not, it's a classification of an employee, and we'll talk about the other factors that factor in. So in looking at what a 1099 contractor is, there's many different terminology terms that you'll hear. You'll hear independent contractor, you hear ICs, you hear the 1099, which is the form, along with the word contractor. I've seen 1099 IC used, I've seen contractor, I've seen freelance, and I've seen gig worker. All of those mean independent contractor who is operating as a small company, but is usually only one person. So you're an independent contractor if you are self-employed. And that also means that you are paying your own self-employment tax. So that's what the IRS defines an independent contractor as. So there are 3 criteria that they look at the IRS when it comes to determining the general rule. And I say general because we'll talk about the common law, is that they look at the behavioral criteria. They're looking at work, including the amount of hours that are worked, the tools that are used for the job, certain tasks that are being completed, how is the work being done? And if that's the case, then this person is an employee. If you actually control how they're doing it, and that's how they define the behavioral control over a worker, and that would define somebody as an employee. There's also financial control. And again, this is very nuanced as well, but it's how the worker is paid. And basically it comes down to also benefits are included in here, and whether you're paying their benefits, whether you're not paying their benefits, whether a worker can take a loss or a profit. Those are all criteria that you can look at when you're looking at finances. But again, very nuanced, and I'll go through some examples of other ways to look at the financial control. And then there's the type of relationship. If there is a very specific contract in the relationship, it may indicate one that is an independent contractor. However, workers are entitled to benefits, are usually considered to be employees. And usually, I think that was the Microsoft Law case that also helped define what benefits are different between a contract worker versus somebody who is an employee. So in looking at how you define it, because it is very complex. I mean, I know that sounds very simple to say, oh, behavioral control, financial control, relationship type, but it's actually very complex. And a lot of companies, and I'll reiterate this later on, will use third-party companies. Like I've had big clients that use the companies I've worked for, and I do it for clients as well, where I go in and I look at the job description and I help them define whether that job description is a W-2 role or whether it's a 1099 role. And then you also have to look at the worker themselves, and are they acting as a 1099 contractor or a W-2? So there's several different data points that you have to be able to look at. But there's a 20-factor test that's been developed based on not just what the IRS has defined, but also case law. So a lot of obviously cases have gone to the court to be resolved and to get their interpretation. And based on their interpretation, there's a 20-factor test of questions that need to be asked to be able to determine if somebody is an independent contractor or if they are an employee. So in this case, for example, if you're looking at a contractor or employee, you'll see in the contractor, a bookkeeper that comes into an organization once a week to do bookkeeping. If they have other clients, they control when their work will be done, and they control how it's done, and then just give the results to the client. That's obviously an independent contractor. They control the worker. I mean, they control themselves, they control the work output, and they're basically just giving the results of that work to the client. On the other hand, if a bookkeeper is required to come in for a specific number of hours each week, as determined by a director of the company, and is given very detailed instructions of what needs to be done, then that person would be considered an employee. So, in a case example of how a bookkeeper can be either a contractor or an employee. And that's again shows and highlights how complex this is, and how you have to be very careful about how you engage with a 1099 contractor versus an employee. On the other hand, if you look at a child's nursery worker and secretaries, they must be treated as employees, and it's very defined because they do not have the right to control or direct their work, their given work. So those would be defined as automatically employees. On the other hand, a gardener who uses his own equipment and is paid to keep, let's say, the cemetery or the garden lawn mowed, to keep clear of branches, would be treated as an independent contractor because you're just paying them, and they come in and maintain the grounds however they like, so long as it meets your criteria. That would again be a contractor. So if you're looking at the case law, so we're looking at now, we've shifted from that's what the definition of the IRS is and how they've defined it. Now we're looking at how courts have actually ruled on it. So in this case, you have the court actually ruling and saying that a person who is required to comply with the instructions about when, where, and how he is to work is an ordinary employee. Some employees may work without receiving instructions because they are highly proficient and conscientious workers. So again, executives may be a worker. I mean, they're an employee because they don't require specific directions, but that also has implications with a 1099 contractor, because again, you can't give them instructions on how to be able to do things. All you can give them is what you want them to do as an end result. Here's an example of behavioral controls. If a worker must perform services in order or in sequence, so if you have a process, and they must do every step in the process, then that worker is not free to follow their own pattern of work, but must instead follow an established routine by your company. And that person would be defined as an employee if they have to follow your processes. And I will give some examples, even myself as a case study. I am a consultant, so I am a 1099 contractor for some of my clients who treat me, some of them treat me as an independent contractor and just say, please do this and give me the results. And some of them actually, I could call the IRS right now if I wanted to and report them because they treat me like an employee. And in this case, I have one client I'm thinking about in particular that has very specific steps that they're asking me to follow, which by definition is what an employee would be asked to do. Also, if you're requiring that a worker give you a report, so it says the requirement that workers report to a supervisor is an indication of control over the worker and the existence of an employment relationship, as does the requirement that the worker submit regular oral or written reports to a person or persons for whom the services that they're being performed. So if, let's say, you're in a contract with somebody for 6 months to do something, let's say it's a web development, for example, and you're asking them to monitor the email questions that are coming in through the Contact Us page, and you're asking them for a report, then technically you would be treating them as an employee instead of a worker. And you might, for example, you could give them very specific instructions, say, please let me know if there's emails for these particular criteria, or please forward all emails to this email address, or notify us of certain things. And then you're allowing them to direct their day. But if you're asking them to give you oral or written reports, then you are in that borderline area that could actually rule against you in the court of law. And this would be a ruling as well. So again, here's another example where you have to use a discretion because of the worker's occupation and the methods of professional work that are prescribed by techniques and standard of their profession. So the high degree of skill required for a profession sometimes make it difficult or impossible for a worker to supervise their work. So if you look at what this says, as I have highlighted, despite the absence of direct control over the manner of which a professional man shall conduct their professional duties, it cannot be doubted that many professional men are employees. And that was for a very specific case and why it was written that way by the judge. That was a judge's decision. So again, talking about the fact that you have to be very careful, even in professional positions, where you have to look at how you're treating that person because of how case law has ruled. So here's another one for control of the worker. So the establishment of set hours by a worker is a factor of indicating control. The control bars the worker from being the master of their own time, which is the right of an independent contractor. So if you're saying to someone, well, I need you to be available between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., you may think, because I'm just giving you that window of when you need to be available, by saying that to them and saying that you're putting a time constraint on them can be looked at as controlling the worker because you're making them be available during that time and it's a set time. So again, that was, something to be considerate of when you're using independent contractors. There's ways to be able to think through how to be able to make them available during certain times without making it a requirement of their function. There's also looking at termination of a worker. If an employee has the right to end their relationship at any time, and they are considered by common law to be a termination at will or an at-will employee, but you can't use that for an independent contractor. An independent contractor can end an assignment and not move forward, but it's not like you're terminating them. And I have in my contract right now with one of my clients, the one I'm talking about in particular, they have at will in there. And what they've done is they've just basically taken an employment agreement and modified it with the word independent contractor, and you can't do that. You have to have a separate contract that really looks at the nuances of independent contractor work and making sure that it's completely separate from the contracts that you have for employees. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. This is really, I don't know, a lot of, I mean, I want to make sure I'm covering all areas, but this would be in a more governmental area, but also can be an individual or a public official who receives payment from a government fund in the form of a wage or a salary is not a fee-based official, often called compensation. It's actually a fee. So even in the world of government, and I know of several government agencies and also several cities that have actually gotten fines by the IRS for misclassification of workers as well. So it's not just the business world that's getting hit by the IRS, it's also government as well. So in looking at this particular one, looking at the fact that you now have different areas of looking at the relationship. And there are the contracts, as we've talked about, employee benefits that we've talked about, discharge and termination, permanency, which would be if it's a long-term assignment with someone, or regular business activities are also to be considered because, again, those are ramifications of what you would have with an employee that you would not necessarily have with an independent contractor. So if the arrangement contemplates reoccurring work, and the relationship is considered permanent, even if the services are part-time, seasonal, or short duration, this is an employee relationship. And so that's another classification with the current work client that I'm working with right now. It's an ongoing relationship. There's no end. And so I know from some of the other contractors that are working there that they've been working there for 3 years. So they put themselves at risk. And, again, is any one of these items going to tip the scale and cause an IRS fine? Maybe or maybe not, but the more of these that you stack up, in against you, if you will, the more it's easier for the IRS to actually make a determination that you're using an independent contractor as an employee, or that the independent contractor is being misused. So I've actually read IRS rulings, so they're very interesting and very specific in what they look at and how they make these determinations. So looking at how do you manage an independent contractor differently? The first one is I always encourage people to not even really think about a contract, but think about a statement of work. Because a statement of work as a function is designed for project work. And what it does is it has an introduction, a purpose, a scope, where the tasks will be done, what the tasks are, but specifically milestones, because milestones are a way for you to be able to say, well, here's, let's say, a project that's going to take a year. But I want to set up milestones along the way, which are deliverables that you expect from that independent contractor so that they can work independently so long as they're hitting your milestones and that they hit your deliverables and that there's quality metrics along the way so that you accept those milestones so that the project doesn't continue until the milestone has been met. There's also scheduling, standard and testing to make sure that what they're giving you during those milestones are correct. Success, making sure that you are accepting it. Then the requirements would be as they complete the milestones, what are the payments on that? So if let's say it's a $30,000 contract over 6 months, then as they meet those deliverables on the milestones, then you would make the payment. So this is probably the best contract that I've ever had, and we use these a lot in the corporate world to make sure that when we're using a 1099 contractor, that the contract is functionally different than an employee contract, and there are milestones and deliverables along the way. Now, you don't have to set up milestones. You could just have one project be due at a certain time, and there's not a penalty for that. It's just milestones give you more control so that, for example, if you have an employee an independent contractor who's working for 6 months, you don't necessarily have the right, unless you put in milestones, to ask them what they're doing and how they're doing it. That's where you get into the danger zone with reports. So with an employee, you can definitely walk up every week and say, okay, so what are you doing? How are you doing it? But you can't do that with an independent contractor. So by putting some milestones into your contracts, then it gives you that discussion point along the path of getting a project done, where you do have an engagement where you are asking them to provide you with information and updates and making sure that certain things are done along the way, and you're making sure that they're done properly. The other thing that you can also do in a statement of work is you can mandate here the type of worker and skill set of a worker. So for example, if you have an engineering project and you feel that it needs to have a senior level engineer on it, you can put that in here and say, we expect, because of the quality standard expected, that we want to have a senior level engineer with these levels of requirements to be working on this project. Because if you don't say that, then that independent contractor could actually either do the work themselves or hire out and hire somebody who, let's say, is a junior engineer who does the work for them, but doesn't maybe have the knowledge base or the expertise or experience to be doing something at a higher level. So in your statement of work is where you would actually describe for them what you need. And again, that's going to become really critical when you're engaging millennials or, let's say, Zoomers to do projects. These are people who necessarily haven't worked in the corporate world. They don't have necessarily all the experience that you need. These are people who just come out of college with theoretical learning, who've decided to do a project or go into project work and what they love, and you want to make sure that they have the proper skill set. You can write that in your statement of work to make sure that either they have it or they hire people who will meet your qualifications. And also in your statement of work, when you're talking about scope, purpose, and tasks in the introduction, you can also make sure, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but don't forget your insurance. You're going to want to make sure that your independent contractors are carrying the same level of insurance that, let's say, a vendor would carry, although you have to think about it, because a millennial or a Zoomer may not be making a lot of money to be able to afford $1 million insurance policy to cover that. So you may have to look at lowering your insurance requirements for them or making some kind of accommodation for them. But those are things to consider when you're working with a younger generation and they're building themselves out as an independent contractor and may not have the skills. So you definitely would want to have business insurance on them. But also, what that looks like is just something that you should take into consideration. And then also how you close the project down as well. So there's 2 restrictive covenants that you are allowed to engage with a contractor. So you can ask them for a non-solicitation agreement. You can ask them not to contact, if they're working with your customers, for example, in part of the project, you can make sure that they're not soliciting your customers after or during the project. And you can also ask them to sign a non-disclosure, and you should be asking them to sign these 2 agreements. It is within your legal right to ask them to sign these, and that is not considered an employment relationship by asking them to sign these 2 agreements. You also, at this point, there has not been anything by stated by law that you can't do background checks on your independent contractors. So you can still do the same type of background checks, and I have been background checked by some of my clients as well. So you can still do those, although you'll have to make sure that you're in compliance with, like, let's say the Fair Reporting Act and different things like that when you're doing things for independent contractors. But right now, according to the law, you can treat employees, you can do the same type of background check on an employee that you can on an independent contractor. And I think that the most important piece of what I would say is critical, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this component of it, is that you really need to start to think about training. Because when you've got the IRS and now you have this open door policy where you have your independent contractors now able to go to the IRS and complain that they're being treated like employees, it becomes incumbent upon you to make sure that your own employees are trained to know how to work with contractors differently. And I say that from, again, my own experiences using myself as a case study. They brought in someone new on the team I'm working on with my client, with one of my technology client. And this person is not even, doesn't even, you can tell, understand how to work with independent contractors. So for example, he said, so could everybody send me their schedule for today? I would like to be able to sit down and shadow you to understand what's going on. And one of the independent contractors chimed in and said, I don't think that you can ask us that question. So they're becoming very vocal about, what they will accept and what they won't. So for example, if, in the training class that I have, I've trained people to say instead to put out, let's say, an Excel document and list your times that you're available and have a sign up sheet where people can sign up. That's a better way of engaging with an independent contractor where you're just giving your time of availability, and you're letting them go and look at their schedule and say when that they would be available to meet. So there's a lot of different ways that you want to make sure you train your employees to engage with your independent contractors. Again, things like weekly meetings. And when you're mandating, like I have been, and to attend a weekly meeting, it gets complicated. On the other hand, my more seasoned client, who's the one who actually hired me, she also knows that if I don't show up or if any of the contractors don't show up, she records the meetings because she knows that she can't make us. She just basically says, we're having a weekly meeting with our employees and we ask that the independent contractors attend. And if you can't, we will make a recording available. That is a better way of being able to engage with an independent contractor. And say, here's what my structure is, I want you to join it, but if you can't, then, you can watch this as well. So you really want to make sure that you're training your own employees to engage properly, because all it takes is one of your employees that is not working with an independent contractor correctly, and it can impact your entire organization. And so again, I'm giving you my own examples of my clients. And I also have another client, for example, as I mentioned, who she gives me a project, and usually it's doing some strategy for her and creating slide decks for her. And she will just give me what the project is, and then I give her what my feedback is and my proposal, and then we usually will sit down and discuss it, and then she will maybe come back and ask me to tweak it. But she lets me work independently. She gives me the date that it's due, and that's how you should be doing it. So it's really very complex. And as you talked about with the case law, it's always changing. So you have this really at-risk area that many companies, I mean, they've known that these independent contractors have been around for 20 years. And I think that people they still don't really understand how to engage with 1099 contractors. And the smart ones that I've seen have actually gone out and said, hey, listen, I don't really understand, and either I want you to train me on how to do it, or can you just do it for me? So again, I've worked with a lot of companies where they will send me the job description and say, can you look at this job description and tell me the way it's written, is it a W-2 job or is it a 1099 job? And then I will help them vet out what that is. And then they post it. They get people who respond to it, and then I help them vet that person. So when you're looking at a contractor, for example, you have to look at someone and say, okay, well, this job position is for an independent contractor, but is the person who's applying really an independent contractor? So you're going to want to look, do they have a website? Do they have their own marketing materials? Do they have multiple clients? You also have to look at the fact that you can't consume 40 hours of their work week, because how are they going to have other clients and be an independent contractor with multiple clients if you're consuming 40 hours of their work week? So those are the kinds of things that I look at on a job description to say, okay, well, maybe you should scale back the hours on this job description, because everything on here, you're asking someone to work independently and to present you with the results of what they're doing, but you're asking them to do it, for 40 hours a week. So you have to be mindful of that when you're doing that as well. So again, there's a lot of different training programs that are out there to train your employees. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But again, I can't stress enough how important it is to talk about, making sure that your employees are trained as well. So I'm just going to recap a little bit. I know it's a little bit early. And I'm going to go back over a few things as well as I go through these. I'm going to go back to some of the slides that we talked about. But again, this is the future workforce, and I can't stress that enough. You have a lot of companies like Elon Musk now threatening workers to let them go. You have Starbucks saying that they are going to, begging workers to come back. And that's where I guess I can't emphasize enough that you don't control the worker anymore. And This job market is completely different. And that's where a lot of companies have been struggling by doing the same thing, expecting different results, which is, we know the old joke, that's the definition of insanity. So you really have to start to really think about creating a blended workforce and really looking at your jobs and saying, okay, so which ones are truly workers, that employees that I need to have here, and which ones are really more of an independent contractor. So for example, I'm getting a lot of customers that are calling me and asking me to come in and help with marketing. Why? Because, for example, writing an RFP. Writing an RFP is a project. There's a very beginning and there's an end. I also have clients coming in and asking me to help because I have an HR background, and putting in workforce management solutions and managed service programs is coming in and helping them with implementation. Why? Because implementation has a beginning and it has an end. So you can write a statement of work saying, hey, I've just hired this, I've just won this new business. I need your help to come in and implement this managed service program for staffing, where we have a vendor management solution, and I need help going from the beginning to the end of maybe migrating a current MSP system that maybe you have it with another client and you're migrating it to a new client, or maybe you just put in one and you have no idea, so you're starting to collect data to be able to build one. Those are all projects. And again, marketing can be considered a project. Maintaining a website can be a project as well. So it's going into your organization as a whole and starting to look at those pieces that can be outsourced as an independent contractor. You also have the ability to look at the jobs that you can't fill right now and that have been out, you've been out looking for an employee for quite some time, and to consider, is this a job that really is an employee type job that I really need to have control of the worker? Or is this job better suited for independent contractor because I'll get it filled faster? So there's different places out there, and you're talking about that future workforce. They're on Upwork. You can find them on, I think it's called freelancers.com. There's a lot of different, TopTel is another one as well for, I think that's really more for IT and technology and engineers. So there's a lot of these independent contractor and freelancer sites where you can go out and find freelancers for a project. And I've seen fixed base programs where it's a flat fee. I've seen some, which like mine that I'm on right now is an hourly rate. However long I work is how much I get paid. So there's a lot of different ways to be able to do that. The second thing is to look at the IRS holds the jurisdiction over the term employee and independent contractor, and realizing that you really need to understand IRS. And I've sat in IRS seminars and I've done white papers on 1099 contractors when I was working in the staffing industry, because it is, and I was doing, I think that first white paper I wrote was maybe 10 years ago, because even then people were starting to look at this shift, but it's been such a subtle shift. And it wasn't really till the millennial generation that now all of a sudden people are going, okay, well, independent contractors. So for example, one of my clients was Sony. Sony is almost all independent contractors because they contract with gamers who either do the programming behind the scenes or do the testing for the gaming programming. So they've actually been doing independent contractors for a long time. Now that companies are starting to have to look at it, you really need to take a step back and go back and understand what the IRS means by independent contractor when it comes to employee, and what an independent contractor is, and be able to shift your organization to be able to do that. And that also means maybe adjusting your processes in your company so that you have, I don't know how many are on here that have ISO quality management systems, but part of that is making sure that you have them available so that if your worker gets stuck and they don't know how to be able to manage an independent contractor, that they know what the rules and your processes are for getting help to understand how can I control this worker, or what do I do now, or having that open door with asking HR how to be able to manage an independent contractor when they get stuck, with maybe they need an update and they want to ask that independent contractor for an update, but they have HR or resources available to know how to be able to ask for that. Then there's the IRS 3 criteria for classifying a worker. It's very complex, but there's the behavioral, there's the control, and there's the type of relationship. And those are just the guidelines. Again, because case law is changing this all the time, you really do need to stay abreast with all the case law that's coming out and how that changes what they define as behavior and type of relationship. And then you have the 20-factor test. So that is this combination. And if anybody would like to have a copy of that, I'm happy to provide that to someone. And you can send me an email and ask me for that. But it's a 20-factor test that when you're looking at how to vet someone, it helps you walk through. And that 20-factor test looks at, yes, these are these 3 criteria that the IRS has given as a guideline, but it also factors in the case law that has become established to make sure that you are asking the right questions. And I know I got indoctrinated into this 20-factor test very early with a vendor management system, a company that had actually built some of the vetting into their tool. And there was some of it that still needed to be eyes, it had to be a human being that was looking at things. But for the most part, they took and were able to automate through technology many of these things that when you're putting a job description in, it was able to help someone say, hey, that's an employee status, or that's an independent contractor status. And then they would send that result to someone to actually vet, let's say, the employee. So there's technology that's going to get more. I mean, there's some technology that's out there, and I would expect that technology will get more enhanced that's out there. But again, there's this 20-factor test that will help you be able to at least start to ask really good questions about if somebody is a W-2 or a 1099 status. And then, as I mentioned, there's the common law rulings, and that is what makes this dynamic and very complex, is that all it takes is a lawsuit tomorrow that resolves, and the judge makes a decision on an interpretation of the IRS law for behavior, let's say, for example, and that's going to change how we assess behaviors. So, keeping abreast of the laws that change when it comes to how you classify the behavior, the control, and the type of relationship is going to be critical. And then managing independent contractors requires different contracts and different methods of engagement. So again, as I mentioned, there's a statement of work, which I highly recommend, but there are other types of contracts that you can use to make sure that you are establishing very clearly this independent relationship where they are able to perform the work itself by themselves and are giving you the end result, but that you're making sure that it's very clear what you expect that end result to be and the type of caliber of talent that you expect to have worked on that project. And again, as I mentioned, the milestones along the way, but then also reminding yourself that you can ask for non-disclosure agreements, you can ask for background checks on them, you can ask for their insurance policies as well, and you should be, to make sure that you're always protecting your company as well. And then, as I mentioned, that training should be required to protect your company from independent contractors being mismanaged. So, again, all it takes is one new employee. And again, it's not something that you would normally consider as an onboarding type training, but it should be, especially if they're going to be managing independent contractors, or if your company is looking at including independent contractors as well. A lot of people, again, will go, like I have gone along with it for various reasons, but there's a lot more now that are becoming very vocal and going to complaints. And as I mentioned, I've read some of the IRS rulings where they look at everything. They look at the contract that you have with that worker. They look at the type of relationship. They look at the payment schedule. They look at everything. And they will break it down for you when the IRS is giving its ruling. And then you have the chance to rebut it. You can go back and say, well, thank you, Mr. IRS. I appreciate that's what you said, but here is why we feel that this person is a 1099 contractor. But at the end of the day, they're going to take, what they feel based on case law and everything, and they're going to make a determination, and whatever that determination is, you're going to have to accept it. So in many cases, what I've seen is that independent contractors are being treated like employees, and the IRS is saying that they will go in and they will change that worker's classification automatically from a 1099 contractor to a W-2. And then they will penalize you not with just the fine for doing it, but also all the back taxes that you should have collected on that employee. So it gets very expensive and it gets very tricky. So again, I always, again, we're going to always reaffirm to make sure that you're really understanding the ramifications of it. And then again, making sure that training for not just managing them, but help get with the vetting process, to make sure that when they're looking at putting out a job description, that you're looking at the job description itself, and then also the workers that are coming in that you're considering for it, and making sure that the workers are actually independent contractors. And a lot of the sites like Upwork do a very good job of doing that. In fact, Upwork, I know, has where all the payments done through their platform, to make sure that you're protected and you can have an adjudication process if something is not, you don't feel that the work was done right and you paid for it. They also have like a diary where that person can write in, here's what I did during this time that I'm booking towards the project. They've done a very good job of making sure that the process for payment is automatic and that you're really getting people that are freelancers based on their quality. So they have, they can now put up their WBE certifications like I have. I'm a WBE and a DBE diversity certification. So those are actually on my Upwork platform because I do use Upwork as well. So again, there's a lot of different ways to be able to engage with a worker who's an independent contractor. So looking at, again, the Supreme Court decisions relating to independent contractor status, such as how essential is the services rendered to a business, how permanent is the working relationship, the sum of the contractor's investment in equipment and materials, again, if they're using your equipment versus using their own equipment, the contractor's opportunity for profit and loss, and the amount of the independence that the contractor has from your business are all considerations that the Supreme Court has looked at when it comes to making the determination of independent contractors. So that's really my presentation for today. I kind of left it open for questions in case there's a lot, because there is a lot to unpack. I didn't even cover, there's a lot of material I didn't have time to really go into. It would have taken my presentation to an hour and a half if I'd gone into everything, but I think I tried to hit most of the key points and then spend more time reinforcing what those key points are to make sure that it's really clear what I think are the most important things about understanding the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. And again, the most important reason for me is it dovetails with what I talk about with the generations, is that the youngest generation of the millennials and the Zoomers are going to be the largest workforce. So the boomers were the largest workforce, but they are now retiring. Gen X is actually your smaller workforce that's out there, and they're in the process of deciding to retire. And millennials are right now currently the largest workforce, but the Zoomer generation, which is Gen Z, are going to be even larger than the millennials. So that between the millennials and the Zoomer, you are now, and by the way, the Zoomer or the millennials are topping out at, I think, almost 47 years old in their age bracket. So it's not that younger generation that you're thinking of. They're actually, a lot older than you necessarily think. But that generation has decided that they're not, that there's some of them that just said, I want to be an independent contractor, and they've chosen that path. And especially after COVID has burned a lot of people out where they're now working from home and they're saying to themselves, hey, if I've got to work this hard for a company, I want to do it from the privacy of my own home where I'm comfortable. I have the surrounding that is of comfort to me if I'm going to put in those kind of hours. And that's why you're seeing this resistance, I believe, of people who don't want to go back into the workforce and who are now choosing, and I would classify myself as one of them, who are now choosing to be a consultant, an independent contractor versus being an employee. And I've been an employee my entire life. And I have now made that decision where I don't want to work in corporate anymore. I want to take all my skills that I've learned and become an independent contractor. And again, how can I get that message out? Because again, I've got several clients that are treating me as an employee that could get in a lot of trouble. And I will eventually figure out how to break the news to them that they should be very careful. And it's on definitely my agenda and my plan to do that. But needless to say is that a lot of people are using independent contractors inappropriately, and that's really kind of what led this discussion today, is to really kind of reinforce that you've got a generation that is going to be requiring independent contractor and freelance work of the future, and how you need to, as a company, start to look at the jobs that you have in your company and start to identify which ones are true employees that you must have control over them. And maybe just, which ones could be in the future an independent contractor. Maybe they're an employee right now, but if you're starting to look for that workforce in the future and you are, looking at that, you might want to identify some of those jobs that could be independent contractor jobs, that you can start to make that migration in the type of work that's related there. And then maybe if that person moves on to a different position or they leave the company, then you can now make that decision to say, okay, well, it was an employee position, but now when we put it back out looking for a new worker, we're going to be looking for an independent contractor because we have identified this as a position that could be outsourced. So again, some different thoughts on that. So that is it.
Yeah, if we're ready for questions, I don't see any yet, Amy. As we wait for them, any closing thoughts? Or were those kind of your closing thoughts?
Well, actually, I would just say again, thank you for everybody. I know that everybody's time is very valuable. And if there's anything that I can do to help your organizations, please reach out. That's what I'm trying to do, is take my knowledge and lessons from watching clients struggle. I've watched Fortune 500 companies struggle with this same problem, all the way down to smaller companies, startups. So it's just becoming more of a concern that, especially with this younger generation, I felt like it was something that needed to be revisited. But if there's an idea where you wanted me to take and talk a little bit more, I'm open to taking one of these key components, or also talking about some of the other areas of the independent contractor concerns too.
And your contact information is on your slide. So if you're maybe nervous to discuss these things, online in this format, you definitely could reach out to Amy personally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is, sometimes some companies I have found don't want to necessarily, especially if they're an HR company, I found even HR companies I've worked for don't handle the 1099 contractors correctly. So sometimes it might be something where you just want to privately reach out and ask questions, and I'm happy to guide. And everything that I do is confidential, obviously. I do really respect that. But again, when you sit in these IRS seminars and you listen to how strict they are and how fierce they're becoming because we are moving to that workforce, it is something that you need to definitely consider looking at, even if it's just planning for the future.
Well, I don't see any questions. Do you want to focus on one of the areas, Amy, while we still have some time left?
Sure, I can go back. Let me go back. So I would spend time talking about the statement of work. Again, talking about how important that is. I've seen a lot of people who enter contracts. In fact, I've looked at a couple that they'll say independent contractor at the top of the contract. And yet when you're looking at the base of the actual contract, they're using terms like at will. They may say, hey, we're not going to be paying you insurance, but then they're talking about you need to work at our offices, 5 days a week, or make yourself available from 8 to 5. So even using that employment contract and trying to refurbish it can cause problems because you might not catch everything that's in that contract that is really troublesome. So I always recommend the statement of work. So again, when you're talking about payments, again, they can be cyclical, they can be milestones, how that pay delivered. And one thing to consider about payments is that, especially when you're talking about that younger generation, they are now, especially the Zoomers, are digital native. So you should consider thinking about Venmo. I know a lot of people that are paying off of Venmo. I've paid doctors with Venmo now, or PayPal. So not just your traditional Visa, MasterCard, because a lot of people aren't using Visa, MasterCard, and they won't go through the process of getting a merchant account, which I've sold merchant accounts in the past, and they're difficult to get. And a lot of people can find other ways like using PayPal. So you have to start to consider different types of payment options when you're talking about being able to consider, looking at independent contractors that are a younger generation. And then also looking at your standard in testing, which is number 9, is when you get the milestones and you've said this is my deliverable, needing to make sure that you bake in having time for your team to look at what the work has been done and making sure it meets your criteria and that you've tested it. So you're not just saying, okay, well, thank you for that deliverable, and then moving on and then finding out, let's say after this contract is ended, that there's something wrong or that, something had, got missed in what you were doing, and trying to go back and get that independent contractor to be able to do it. that becomes highly problematic. So you want to make sure when you're developing your milestones to start thinking about what could be tested and what are your standards. So if you have, let's say you're using an ISO standard for your quality metric system, or you have a different type of qualification, you want to make sure that those standards are required as part of that testing stage of the project. And then making sure that you're looking at, you have sponsors and stakeholders, that's number 10, that we really haven't talked about, but making sure that the statement of work also has your people that are sponsors within your organization that are also looking at it, and making sure that it's passed that success test. Because again, there's nothing worse than having it go all the way through all the milestones and all the deliverables, and then there's a problem along the way. And there are technology tools where, again, some of these vendor management systems will actually have an 1099 contractor component where they can upload, let's say, drawings, or they can upload testing tools or pieces of what your project is into the tool. They can allow you to see the type of workers that they've assigned to work on your project, and you can see the time. So there's a lot of technology out there that can make managing milestones much easier. And so I can do another presentation if anybody were interested or want to ask me questions about the type of technology that would be needed. And I can also give a sample statement of work if somebody is looking at and they don't have a sample statement of work. I can provide one as well. And I would say that's probably the one that I would spend the most on is talking about the contracts, because that's what really trips people up, I think. Because your contract should be there to protect you.
This is such great information and so timely, Amy. I really appreciate it. Any closing thoughts?
Nope. Again, I just caution everybody to start thinking about it, because it is the wave of the future and it's not a trend. It's not going away.
I think you hit the head on the nail right there.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for your time and expertise, and thank you to the audience for your participation. The handout, survey, and certificate are now available on the webinar registration site. I will send an email out to you with instructions how to get those documents. The recording of this webinar will also be available shortly. Please find our upcoming webinars at webinars.michamber.com. Today's program is copyright 2022 by the Michigan Chamber of Commerce with all rights reserved. Have a wonderful day, everybody.